How will global energy markets respond to the war in Iran? As a tentative ceasefire continues to hold, my guest today, Doomberg, warns that if hostilities continue, all bets are off and the price of a barrel of oil will be the least of our worries. He breaks down how he sees the global energy markets unfolding in the aftermath, including oil, liquefied natural gas, and why Europe is the biggest loser in all of this. He also discusses why he expects the Russia-Ukraine conflict to ramp up in short order, what China's role is in all of it, and so much more. So let's dive into it. Doomberg, great to have you back on Commodity Culture once again. I want to start with the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the impacts that it's having on global energy markets. Firstly, how do you assess the impact that it's already had, and how much worse do you think things could get if the war drags on for months or, God forbid, even years from this point?
Yeah, I don't think it's a matter of the war dragging on. It's a matter of the war restarting. So let's take your question in order. I would say analysts have been surprised at the resilience of the oil market, and the thesis that best explains it is beginning to coalesce around China's pre-buying before the war and its vast decrease in imports since the war started, which in essence has buffered the oil markets in a way that I think surprises most outsiders, us included, full disclosure. And this goes to show just what a black box China is. And it makes sense that the biggest part of the market that Westerners have the least line of sight into explains the mystery of why oil has been so well behaved. And as we're talking this morning, WTI below 90. What stands before the energy markets now is not so much whether the current détente continues, but whether, if war breaks out again and Iran follows through on its threat, which we think is being wildly underappreciated by the, quote, finish the job crowd. Iran has warned that if war breaks out again, it will proactively target and destroy as much of the oil and gas producing assets in the Middle East in a way that they did not do in the first 39 days. But importantly, they did demonstrate the ability to do so in the first 39 days. And when I see the Mike Pompeos of the world and the Lindsey Grahams of the world and the Victoria Nulands of the world and various, Washington, D.C. based neocon senators who allegedly represent Mississippi and Texas and other states that could care less about Iran, talking about Trump needing to finish the job, that necessarily involves restarting hostilities, which means, we think, a true, severe, catastrophic destruction of these assets in a way that guarantees they'll be offline for years. And that the market is not prepared for. No amount of reduced imports by China would paper that over. And so it is our view that Trump is kind of stuck, and he needs to cut a deal that he doesn't want to cut for understandable reasons. The political ramifications to him personally would be severe. And so we're in this weird spot where the market is assuming that hostilities won't resume. But if they do, they're underpricing the consequences of it. We could be wrong. Many comments in our pieces alluding to this risk say that we're overestimating Iranian capabilities. Well, that's true if you get your news from Fox News. I think it's pretty clear, as the data has evolved from the first 39 days of hot war, the Iranians wildly overperformed. We were flagging this before it was becoming common knowledge because of our techniques and tools we use to try to get insight into raw data that most people just don't do. And so that's where we are, we think. Surprisingly resilient thus far. And the dangerous game that's being played is assuming that either Iran is bluffing or does not have the capabilities to follow through on its threats. And we would be wary of holding either of those opinions.
Well, walk us through your thoughts on that worst case scenario. Should hostilities resume? Should the United States and Israel begin to strike Iran with full force? They've talked about potentially targeting energy infrastructure. And then Iran's response being potentially very dramatic, as you've laid out, in terms of destroying energy infrastructure and energy supplies in the region. What impact do you think that could have globally in terms of the potential price on WTI crude, and also the secondary effects on the economy in terms of potential inflation, rising price inflation happening to food products and all sorts of other things in the economy?
Okay, so before I dive into the unfolding of that scenario, which I think is probably like the most important thing we'll talk about. Um, the very same people that we followed before hostilities broke out that warned that Iran would target US bases and its radars in the region, and it would be able to keep firing into Israel for much longer than the West believes, and that it could target with precision US, Gulf countries' oil and gas facilities. All of that turned out to be true. They said they could do it, and they did it. Ras Laffan was hit with precision. The Strait of Hormuz was closed and cannot be reopened militarily. Bahrain was overrun with Iranian missiles and drones to the point where the US had to evacuate it haphazardly. This is all true. You can deny it. You can say because Fox News didn't tell you it didn't happen, but it did happen. And so those same sources are warning that the pipeline that circumvents the strait through the United Arab Emirates will be destroyed. It's right there. It's very difficult to protect that pipeline. That the East-West pipeline across Saudi Arabia will be destroyed, and that the Red Sea will be closed in partnership with the Houthis. If that happens, all the relief valves that have allowed China's tapering of its imports to keep oil under some reasonable bound go away. And now you're talking about full-blown catastrophe, and the price of WTI is irrelevant at that point. And I think in part because China has buffered the price of oil, people have become complacent to that risk. Now, again, we are fully aware that some people listening to this will call us panicans. That's what Trump likes to say. There's a reason why they haven't restarted the war all these days, 45 days since the ceasefire. Because I do believe that military leaders in the Pentagon, A, know this, and B, have been warning Trump. But we also follow Israeli propaganda. And the right-leaning, hardcore wing of Netanyahu's government is demanding a restart to the war, is rejecting Trump's negotiations, and it wouldn't take much in the way of a few rogue Israeli military operations to restart the war, whether or not Trump wants to or not. And so, on balance, I think the risks to that domino falling, hitting the next domino, hitting the next domino, and next thing you know, the East-West pipeline has been bombed, and the Red Sea's closed, and the pipeline through the United Arab Emirates has been destroyed. And suddenly, the full 20 million barrels a day is gone for a very long time. Negotiations or ceasefires notwithstanding, because physical damage will take time to repair. I think the market is probably underpricing that today as we sit here with $90 oil. But that's, we think, the way things would unfold. So imagine Israeli Air Force bombs Iran's gas fields and its desalination facilities, and Iran says, all right, we're back to war. Whether or not Trump knew or approved doesn't matter. We're going back to war, and we're going to, quote, finish the job on this side. And a full-blown barrage starts hitting Israel, targeting their water treatment facilities and their power plants, and the Houthis get into the war. And then Iran risks provoking an Israeli nuclear response. There's a whole lot of ugly scenarios here where even if Trump doesn't want it to happen, it could happen. So I think, the finish the job crowd, these are the same people that were trumpeting for war for decades. And how has that done for them so far? This first, again, if it were so easy, if there were a military solution, it would have been imposed by now.
How do you think this could potentially impact global food supplies? Because we've heard talk of potential food shortages, famines. We obviously know that a large amount of urea runs through the strait, responsible for creating fertilizers. and assuming we did see a further reduction in LNG flows, also a key input to fertilizer products, perhaps that could have an impact as well. Now, this is all sitting on top of, I believe the USDA has come out and said that it's a very dry season, growing season upcoming in the United States. Also, meaning potential crop yields could be impacted. Do you think this could create sort of a perfect storm in terms of a food shortage situation globally?
Again, where we are now versus the worst case scenario, I think it's always important to identify which of those scenarios we're talking about. Where we are now, there's going to be some people that starve. They're going to be predominantly in poor countries. They are always the ones that suffer first and suffer the most. For the developed world, there's not going to be shortages of food. There will be inflationary pressures, but it will be manageable. If the scenario that we just described, the full-blown return to all-out war happens, which is in nobody's interest, by the way. It's not in Iran's interest. It's not in America's interest. It's not in Israel's interest. It's not in the Chinese interest. If that scenario unfolds, all bets are off. It's kind of like a singularity. Very difficult to predict what happens on the other side of that. Fertilizer shortages for next year's planting cycle will be the least of people's concerns in that scenario.
The sponsor of today's episode is ARC Silver Gold Osmium. Owner Ian Everard is praised even by his competitors as one of the most honest and level-headed bullion dealers in the United States. They have some great prices. You can see some of them displayed right now on screen. Take advantage of these specials today by reaching out to Ian at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com. Make sure to tell him, of course, that Commodity Culture sent you. And now, back to the interview. What about the LNG landscape? Because we've seen a lot of that supply get taken offline, not only the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but as you pointed out, the strikes and subsequent shutdown of Ras Laffan in Qatar, the world's largest LNG hub, taking an estimated 17% of Qatar's LNG capacity offline for what's estimated to be several years. Which regions of the world are most affected by this, and how does it change the global LNG landscape?
Of all the risks on the board, the risk to the natural gas market, in our view, is the most manageable, with a couple of exceptions. So let's just do the numbers. Let's round up and assume Qatar was 20% of global LNG, which it isn't. And let's assume that LNG is 20% of natural gas, which it isn't. 0.2 times 0.2 is 0.04. And the U.S. is racing to build LNG export capacity and running full throttle. Other facilities are coming online, Canada. And there's an enormous amount of natural gas in the world. So, for example, the one region that would be hit the hardest is Europe. And it always has the political option to restart gas from Russia, assuming they find an amenable Moscow to do a deal with. So in a true crisis, the existing leaders in Europe would get wiped away, and you could always, there's one of the Nord Stream pipelines is still full and ready to go, and you have the pipelines that cross through Poland that are dormant today. There's a world where sort of politics intervenes and that gets fixed. So the region that gets hurt the most is Europe, and they are suffering. But, Australia has been cutting deals with Asian refiners to make sure it gets its diesel and jet fuel so that they continue to get their LNG, which has been working for them. We're pulling string on a piece on how the Australian government has actually done a pretty good job of managing this emergency thus far. But LNG, of the things on the board that concern us, we're least worried about it because, by the way, it has been fully offline, full-blown, since the war. And extra U.S. supply and extra natural gas from other sources and switching back to coal in Asia has more than absorbed that risk. And as we're talking today, LNG landed at Europe is just under $16 a million BTU, and natural gas is still being given away in the U.S. So of the catastrophic potential risks on the board, LNG is the least of our concerns.
Is Russia coming out as a winner in this Iran war scenario? Because so far, both the US and the UK have issued temporary waivers and licenses to allow the sale of Russian seaborne oil, once again proving how ridiculous sanctions are in the first place. Would you say this conflict in the Middle East is positive for the Russian economy?
It's positive in the short term for its oil export receipts, which is somewhat offset by the droning campaign against Russian export facilities and refineries, which we think is absolutely crazy that Europe is blessing this, because Europe is the one that gets hurt the most, even more than Russia. If you think about this conflict as World War III, as we have done, and our mental model is that World War III started in 2014, which we can talk about if you're interested. For the US to be expending expensive air defense missiles and attack missiles in Iran and not being sold to the Ukrainians to be used against Russia is a win for Russia. And under the radar, underreported in the West, is this significant escalation that's about to occur in the Russia-Ukraine war. The call between Lavrov and Rubio yesterday is not getting near the attention, say, in the Western media as it is in Russia. I'm sure you're aware, but maybe your listeners aren't, but there was a drone attack on what appears to be a college dormitory in Lugansk, and many Russian students were killed in that attack, and the Russians have decided that they're going to basically raise Kiev. And we saw an Orezhnik hit a suburb of Kiev. We saw the most sort of voluminous missile attack on Kiev since the war began, and the Russians are overtly warning European and other Western diplomats, including US diplomats, that they should leave Kiev for their own safety. And those warnings are largely being ignored. And so if Russia follows through and basically targets Zelensky, which is what they're saying they're going to do, we're going to see a significant escalation in Ukraine. So back to your question, does Russia, quote, benefit? To the extent that Western military arsenals have been depleted in the Middle East, far away from Russia's border, in a way that has caused oil prices to go higher, sure, they benefited. But at the same time, it's not like the war in Ukraine is settling down either.
Yeah, let's dive into the war in Ukraine and the escalation you see ahead, as well as how it all fits in to your thesis on World War III starting in 2014. Now, it wasn't that long ago that I was seeing a report circulating on social media. Perhaps I should verify those more closely, but that there was going to be potential talks between Putin and Zelensky, and perhaps they were going to be able to negotiate and find an end to this conflict. Since then, of course, we've seen drone strikes occur and attacks occur in both directions. And the latest one, which you mentioned, obviously a very serious escalation at this point. How do you see that all playing out? Because we've heard from so many different analysts that Russia has the upper hand on the battlefield when it comes to this war, and yet they haven't been able to wrap things up militarily. You hear all sorts of theories. Well, they're trying to slowly grind this out so that they can empty the coffers of the West as they support Ukraine. They're trying to cause as many casualties as possible. It's a military strategy. But at the end of the day, now we've seen this direct attack on a dorm killing students. Why do you think Russia hasn't been able to wrap this up? How do you see it advancing from here? And how does this all tie into World War III being underway?
So the first thing to say is there's an enormous amount of propaganda. And so save the angry comments. We read all the propaganda and we settle on our own conclusions. For example, there's an enormous amount of British-inspired propaganda around the casualties that Russia is suffering. And yet, independent third-party observers of body count exchanges between the two sides, because they exchange bodies, shows a wildly lopsided number of Ukrainian casualties being given to the Ukrainians by the Russians and hardly any going the other way. The standard counter to that is, well, Russia's advancing and they're collecting more bodies. Well, if it can't both be true, is the war stagnant and Russia's not advancing, then why is it's like 1,000 bodies for every 25 the other way? Russia has been treating this as a special military operation. It has not done a full mobilization. Putin has, in our view, tried to manage this in a way that minimizes the impact on the average Russian and is coming under ever increasing amounts of criticism for the need to take the gloves off. And of course, if and when he does that, that'll be portrayed in the West as weakness and desperation, and Putin's on the way out and all this other stuff. So how's the war going? Russia is slowly grinding depending on which mapping project you follow, and we follow a half a dozen of them, the pace has either slowed or has been slightly reversed in the past, let's say, 2 months. But at the same time, the Ukrainian air defenses are getting less and less effective just by visual inspection of the videos that come out after every nightly attack. And I don't see a scenario where the strategic defeat of Russia that was believed to be the outcome of this war all the way back in 2022 is on the board. I don't think anybody is saying that. And the U.S. has stopped supplying significant funds to Ukraine. The U.S. has stopped supplying significant new weapons to Ukraine. It doesn't have them. It is prioritizing Israel and the Middle East over Ukraine. That is just a fact. And so from that perspective, from the slow, grinding war of attrition that the Russians have always fought, things seem to be going relatively on plan. And we'll see how things go from here. There's undeniable evidence that the country of Ukraine is being destroyed. And we have long argued that many of the tactics that the Russians are using, including the wanton destruction of largely civilian electricity and water infrastructure, are war crimes. If Putin does it in their war crimes, then when, frankly, the U.S. does it, what does that make them? Like if Trump is threatening to destroy the civilian infrastructure of Iran, by the same measure, call a spade a spade. So one has to watch and see what happens with the next round of escalation in Kiev. We don't doubt for a second that Russia is just as capable of taking out Zelensky as the U.S. and Israel were of taking out, Iranian senior leaders. They have thus far chosen not to. If they begin to do so, does the West have a credible complaint against that? After what's happened in Iran, I would argue no. After what happened in Venezuela, I would argue no. The Russians certainly will argue no. So I think we're at a pretty important phase in the war. Now, we were thinking about writing a piece on potential hotspots, because none of this is being reported over here. Belarus could enter the war. There's a lot of noise about Belarus entering the war. You have Transnistria in Moldova, which is a hotspot waiting to happen. You have that enclave near the Baltic, whose name escapes me, that is surrounded by NATO. You have all these drones going through Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania into Russian territory, and the Russians warning these countries that there will be severe consequences if they don't get a handle on this. This is a powder keg waiting to happen. Now, to your question about how all this fits into World War III and 2014, look, in order to really understand how the other side is portraying this, you have to go all the way back to the end of World War II. And the victors of World War II were the US and its European allies, Russia and China. And there's no surprise that the United Nations Security Council was formed, and there were 5 vetoes, basically 3 given to the Americans in the form of an American veto, a British veto, and a French veto, and the Russians and the Chinese, the P5. And the entire power structure of the United Nations Security Council was meant to ensure that the victors of World War II were not attacked again. And the theory was, having observed the failure of the League of Nations, that the United Nations would work because the P5 were given a veto power, and the power of the United Nations could never be used against a P5 member because they have that veto. And that would ensure that they would all want to stay in the same power sharing club. And they could punish other countries who went to war, but they couldn't punish each other. And that's failed. That failed basically because the US started sanctioning P5 members. So we think the World War II architecture ended in 2014 with the onslaught of sanctions against Russia after the Ukraine color revolution. Russians would call it a coup. The Europeans and the Americans would call it the liberation of Ukraine. When Putin made his move on Georgia and Crimea, that's when the sanctions were rolled out, unilateral sanctions, not at the United Nations, against a P5 member. And that's why we mark the beginning of World War III there. And then Putin decided to start dumping his treasuries and China opened up the gold window, and all this was done in partnership between those two countries. And now you're seeing two of the P5 members saying, are we sure we want to go down this path? This is not the way it's reported at all in the West, of course. But this is how it is being internalized over there.
What are your thoughts on the current relationship between the United States and China? Because there's a narrative floating around out there that a big part of the war in Iran is to stop energy flows from Iran to China. Obviously, there's been some transactions done in renminbi as well. So some people point out that that could potentially put the petrodollar under threat. So a big part of this is trying to stop that from occurring. Do you think there's any accuracy to that statement?
I mean, there's always a little bit of accuracy to such things. We would say it's more about the petrodollar than the energy flows because people wildly misunderstand China's energy flows. For our June Doom Zoom coming up for our Pro Tier, we're going to do another deep dive on China through the lens of energy. We did one in 2024, and I think it's time to do another. The vast majority of China's energy comes from coal. And crude is becoming less and less of an issue for China. It's still the greatest vulnerability for sure, but if this whole war has demonstrated everything, is that China has thought about this and has prepared for it and has contingency plans. And so it's more about the petrodollar. And this is why the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and Iran now charging a toll to be paid in RMB is, I think, it's self-evident what this war is really about. It's not really about the energy flows to China. It's about breaking the sanction system, which the Russians and Chinese regularly characterize as illegal outside of the United Nations. Well, why do they keep going back to the United Nations, which the U.S. has basically given up on? Because that was the power structure post-World War II that was meant to keep the peace. So when you hear Xi Jinping talk about unilateral sanctions, what they're saying is you're breaking the promise after World War II, and that will trigger World War III. Do you really want to do this? And once you read the official published English language versions of Putin's speeches and Lavrov's speeches and what Xi Jinping says and what they say together in their joint communications, it all comes back to this original P5 post-World War II architecture, even when Putin was just there. In Xi Jinping's official commentary, he literally says, we are not going to relitigate who won World War II. It's right there in black and white. And what he's saying is, no, Japan is not going to rearm, and neither are the Germans. So all this talk about European rearmament, how do you think that is playing in Beijing and Moscow? The victors of World War II were the US, Britain and France, Russia and China, and the losers were Germany and Japan. Japan is remilitarizing and Germany's remilitarizing. Xi Jinping, read the speech. One of the things that I find amazing is there's a whole parade of Western commentators who don't even read what the other side is saying. How can you think you have a holistic view of the situation in any way that allows you to predict what's going to happen next if you're just ignoring the other half? It's really amazing to me. And then we get called Putin puppets or Chinese puppets. So, for example, we've been saying for years that China is going to catch up and lap the US in semiconductors and AI. What did Huawei just announce? We figured out a way to get to 1.5 nanometers without extreme ultraviolet machines. Why? Because the West, the US, limited their access to extreme ultraviolet machines. All shortages create gluts. There's going to be a glut. And the Chinese are going to crack it. That's not us being pro-China. It's us acknowledging that China is a real powerful country. And so, when you read what they're saying, do we really want to relitigate World War II? Because they're prepared to do it, and perhaps the West is not.
Do you think that China will at some point engage in a kinetic conflict, whether that's taking Taiwan militarily, whether that is entering the war in the Middle East in some form or another? Is there any risk of those events occurring?
I think there's a risk that China will respond militarily to certain red lines, which they have as clear as day articulated are red lines. When you look at what was said to Trump in Beijing, the only hostile words that you could find in any of the official and unofficial communications is around Taiwan. Do not cross this line. The other, we think, red line is if the US Marine Corps starts shooting at, boarding Chinese trade vessels, tankers, cargo ships on the open waters, that would be a red line. for the Chinese. And we note with interest that nobody has yet done that. So China, in their telling of it, is more than prepared to react to a provocation. And they've laid out what those provocations will be. And the same finish the job crowd on Iran are saying we need to sell all these weapons to Taiwan, even though China has said that is a serious red line provocation. As a co-victor of World War II, we find this unacceptable, and we will take these steps if you do that. We note with interest overnight there was another buzzing of Taiwan, 2 or 3 dozen Chinese Air Force jets flying into what Taiwan claims as its sovereign territory. That's a powder keg. Trump leaving China, if you want to know what's actually being said to Trump in China, just go watch his interview with Hannity on the way back. Trump is pretty bad at hiding what's on his mind. And he's like, we can't fight a war this far away. They're 100 miles away. We're thousands of miles away. We can't fight that war. Why was that in his mind coming back from China? Because that's what the Chinese told him.
What was the point of this excursion to China, this summit where he brought Elon Musk and several other big tech CEOs in tow, and in the aftermath, of course, that interview that you mentioned, bringing up Taiwan, because Trump, of course, framed this as a big win, and that relations between the two countries were going to improve, and that the Chinese wanted Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz, and they were on the American side. This was kind of how it was framed. What do you see the purpose of this summit being, and did anything concrete come out of it, or was it just basically political theater?
You tell me. Has anything concrete changed?
No.
Is the Strait open?
No.
Yeah. Has there actually been an order for 200 Boeing jets? I don't know. The next week, Putin was there, and they signed a collaboration to build commercial aircraft together. I think it's mostly theater. I mean, how many Truth Social posts have you read that never manifest?
All of them, basically.
At some point. At some point, you have to say, well, maybe we should take that with a grain of salt.
So after this whole conflict is over, whether one wants to frame it as World War III or as an isolated conflict in the Middle East, but let's also include Russia, Ukraine in this. How do you see both of those conflicts wrapping up, if you had to venture a guess? And what does the geopolitical chessboard look like in the aftermath?
I mean, it depends on the path function, doesn't it? I mean, if the path function to the aftermath is a full-blown kinetic war in the Middle East and a nuclear exchange in Europe, that's different than a negotiated settlement, which seems vanishingly unlikely right now. So I think the thermodynamic end state is a multipolar world where the U.S. is no longer as dominant as it once was, and the rising power is China. How the U.S. lands on that square and then what it does thereafter are the big questions. And that's why I started by saying the path function matters. There's a world where the U.S. executes a temporary strategic retreat to the Western Hemisphere, which we think was, if you injected some truth serum into Trump, would tell you that that was always his preferred approach. And in hindsight, probably regrets the Iranian adventure and wishes he had kept on that path. There's a world where Venezuela is rejuvenated, Cuba is flipped, Argentina firmly in the U.S. camp. The only real outlier is Brazil. There's an election coming up. One thing the CIA knows how to do is interfere in elections in Latin America. There's a world where you have an incremental 10 million barrels a day of oil in the Western Hemisphere that the U.S. could largely control. It could revitalize its manufacturing base, begin to play catch up, or at least defend half the world. That's pretty good, But here we are with a war in the Middle East and a war in Eastern Europe and a potential war in the Pacific. So,
well, let's finish with taking into account everything we've discussed so far today and pose the question, is there anywhere based on all of this where you're seeing opportunity in financial markets at present? Doesn't have to be stock market. I know you're bullish on gold generally, gold and any other assets or areas of opportunity that you see potentially ahead.
Yeah, I would say much depends, again, on whether hostilities break out. Like, it's just such a binary, in that scenario, all bets are off. If we don't see those hostilities, I think we're going to see huge drop in oil and a rush of bullish sentiment. At the same time, you have these large IPOs coming. Those are displacement events. You usually have to sell stuff to buy the new stuff. Large IPOs generally mark the top of markets. Then you go to the next level. The Fed really can't have a top and will have to print very quickly. And so then you get into the hyperinflationary type mindset, and owning gold or other fixed assets becomes attractive. Doesn't mean gold can't flush from here before then. Gold is not an investment, it's a savings vehicle. So I would say we are bullish still. Midstream assets outside of the Middle East. The volume of production of energy will continue to grow in all scenarios, especially outside of the Middle East. So we're doing a Doom Zoom this month here in a couple of days. We'll publish it in a couple of days on Guyana, Exxon's execution down there. There's so much potential in the Western Hemisphere. Focus on things that are unlikely to get blown up and buy and hold those.
Well, Doomberg, fantastic conversation. Tell us about the Doomberg Substack, how people can access these Doom Zooms you've been talking about.
Yeah, so Doomberg.com has everything. And we have 2 products and then a second Substack, Classics Read Aloud, which you can get at Doomberg as well. The 2 Doomberg products are our newsletter, 90 articles a year, $300 a year, going up to 4 after June 1st. So if you're listening to this and you've been pondering subscribing to Doomberg and you want to lock in the old price, depending on when you publish this, Jesse, price goes up after May 31st. And then our Pro tier is another level above that in pricing. And in addition to the 90 articles, you get a fixed video presentation once a month where we do a deep dive on things like After Hormuz, or this Guyana presentation, or the China deep dive that we'll do in June. We put a lot of work into those, a lot of thought into those, and our Pro tier members get priority response directly from me and the rest of the Doomberg team as well. So, Jesse, it's always great to chat with you, and looking forward to the next discussion.
Absolutely. And this interview is going to be coming out tomorrow, May 28th. So there is still time left to take advantage of the previous price at the Doomberg Substack. The link will be in the description below. Great to have you on again, my friend.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us today. This episode is brought to you by ARC, Silver, Gold, Osmium. They have some great prices on precious metals, bullion products. You can see them on your screen right now. These are subject to change, and well supplies last. So reach out to owner Ian Everard today at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com, and make sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.